Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today's story is one that will truly touch your heart. It's about a poor single dad who had nothing left except hope, a tired old truck, and a little girl depending on him. When life pushed him into taking a job nobody else wanted, he thought it was the lowest point of his life. But what happened next changed everything forever. So sit back, relax, and let's dive into this emotional and inspiring story. Daniel Carter stared at the eviction notice taped to the front door of his tiny apartment. The paper moved slightly in the cold wind as he stood there silently, holding his 7-year-old daughter's backpack in one hand and a bag of groceries in the other. His daughter, Lily, looked up at him with innocent eyes. "Daddy, are we in trouble again?" Daniel forced a smile even though his heart was breaking. "No, sweetheart. Everything's going to be okay." But deep inside, he wasn't sure anymore. 3 years earlier, Daniel had a decent life. He worked at a manufacturing plant in Chicago, earned enough to support his family, and dreamed about buying a small home someday. But everything changed the night his wife Emily died in a terrible car accident during a snowstorm. One moment she was there. The next moment she was gone forever. After that, Daniel's entire world collapsed. He tried staying strong for Lily, but grief destroyed his focus. He missed shifts at work. Bills piled up. Eventually the factory shut down, leaving hundreds unemployed, including him. Since then, life had become an endless battle. Daniel worked temporary jobs whenever he could find them. Construction, cleaning, deliveries, warehouse shifts, anything to keep food on the table. But no matter how hard he worked, it never seemed enough. Now the rent was overdue for 3 months. And they were running out of time. That night, after putting Lily to sleep on their old couch, Daniel sat alone at the kitchen table searching for jobs on his cracked phone screen. Most places wanted degrees or experience he didn't have. Others offered wages too low to survive. Then one listing caught his attention. Night maintenance worker needed. Remote mountain property. High pay. Immediate hiring. Daniel frowned. The pay was nearly double what most jobs offered. But underneath, there was one strange sentence. Position has high turnover rate. Few applicants remain longer than 1 week. He read it again. High turnover. Remote mountain property. Night shift only. It sounded suspicious. But desperation leaves little room for pride. The next morning, Daniel borrowed gas money from his elderly neighbor Mrs. Hernandez and drove nearly 4 hours into the mountains for the interview. The property sat deep in the forest surrounded by tall pine trees and thick fog. It looked more like an abandoned resort than a workplace. The massive lodge stood silently under grey skies. Daniel stepped out of his truck and immediately noticed something strange. The parking lot was almost empty. Inside, the front desk clerk barely looked at him. "You are here for the maintenance job." Daniel nodded. The woman sighed softly. "You are the 5th one this month." Before Daniel could ask what she meant, an older man approached wearing a dark coat and gloves. "My name is Walter Hayes," he said calmly. "I manage this property." Walter looked Daniel up and down carefully. "You have experience fixing things." "A little of everything," Daniel replied. "Plumbing, electrical repairs, carpentry, whatever's needed." Walter nodded slowly. The job is simple. You'll work nights maintaining the lower buildings and keeping the generators running. Why does nobody stay? Daniel asked directly. Walter paused for a moment. Most people can't handle the isolation. Daniel glanced around the empty lodge again. How much does it pay? Walter told him the amount. Daniel nearly lost his breath. It was enough to save their apartment and finally stabilize their lives. When can I start? He asked immediately. Walter stared at him carefully. Tonight. That evening Daniel kissed Lily goodbye at Mrs. Hernandez's apartment before driving back into the mountains. As darkness covered the forest, the property felt even stranger. The wind howled through the trees. Old lights flickered along empty pathways. And the silence felt heavy. Walter handed Daniel a flashlight and a ring of keys. There are 3 rules, he said firmly. Daniel listened carefully. First, never go near cabin 12 after midnight. Daniel blinked. What? Walter ignored the question. Second, if you hear knocking underground, don't investigate. A chill ran down Daniel's spine. And third. Walter looked directly into his eyes. No matter what happens tonight, keep the generators running. Daniel forced a nervous laugh. Is this some kind of joke? Walter didn't smile. Then he walked away. For the next several hours, Daniel inspected pipes, repaired broken lights, and cleaned storage rooms. The property was enormous, but strangely empty. Only a few guests stayed there. Most cabins were abandoned. At around 11:45 p.m., Daniel entered the underground maintenance tunnels beneath the lodge to inspect the generators. The tunnels smelled damp and old. Water dripped from rusted pipes overhead. As he checked fuel levels, the lights suddenly flickered. Then went out completely. Darkness swallowed everything. Daniel froze. A few seconds later, emergency red lights activated, bathing the tunnel in crimson shadows. Then he heard it. Knock. 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 Slow. Heavy. Coming from somewhere deeper underground. Daniel's heart pounded. At first he thought maybe another worker was trapped somewhere. But then he remembered Walter's warning. If you hear knocking underground, don't investigate. The sound came again. Knock. 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 This time louder. Daniel gripped his flashlight tightly and backed away. Suddenly the generator alarms started screaming. One of the machines was shutting down. Daniel immediately rushed toward it. Sparks burst from the control panel as the engine sputtered violently. If the generators failed completely, the entire property would lose power during a freezing mountain storm. Working quickly, Daniel grabbed his tools and started repairing damaged wiring. The knocking continued in the distance. Louder. Closer. But Daniel ignored it and focused on the machine. After nearly 20 exhausting minutes, the generator roared back to life. The alarms stopped. And suddenly, the knocking stopped too. Complete silence returned. Daniel stood there breathing heavily. What is this place? He whispered. The next morning Walter found him finishing paperwork in the maintenance office. You stayed, Walter said quietly. Daniel shrugged. I need the money. Walter stared at him for a long moment. Most leave before sunrise. Days turned into weeks. Slowly Daniel adapted to the strange property. The work was hard, but he handled it better than anyone before him. Every weekend he drove home with groceries, paid bills, and small gifts for Lily. For the first time in years, things were improving. Lily smiled more. The eviction notice disappeared. And Daniel finally felt hope returning. But the mysteries of the mountain lodge never stopped. Every night strange sounds echoed through empty halls. Sometimes Daniel noticed lights glowing inside abandoned cabins. Especially cabin 12. One snowy night curiosity finally overwhelmed him. At exactly midnight, he stood outside cabin 12 holding his flashlight. The cabin looked old and broken. Windows covered in dust. Door slightly open. Wind creaked through the trees around him. Walter's warning echoed in his mind. Never go near cabin 12 after midnight. Daniel hesitated. Then slowly pushed the door open. Inside, the cabin was freezing cold. Furniture covered with white sheets. Old photographs lined the walls. And in the center of the room sat a little wooden chair facing the fireplace. Daniel stepped closer carefully. Then his flashlight landed on one photograph. A family portrait. A man. A woman. And a little girl. Daniel's blood turned cold. The little girl looked exactly like Lily. Suddenly footsteps creaked behind him. Daniel spun around. Walter stood in the doorway staring silently. You weren't supposed to come here, Walter said quietly. Daniel held up the photo with shaking hands. Who are these people? Walter's face filled with pain. My daughter. My wife. My granddaughter. Daniel looked again at the little girl. She looks exactly like Lily. Walter slowly sat down. Because sometimes life gives us impossible reminders. Snow blew through the broken doorway as silence filled the cabin. Then Walter finally told the truth. 20 years earlier, the mountain lodge had been famous and successful. Walter owned everything. Wealth, property, luxury cars. Investors respected him everywhere. But one winter night, a fire broke out underground near the generators. The power failed. Emergency systems collapsed. And Walter's family became trapped inside cabin 12 during a blizzard. By the time rescue teams arrived, it was too late. Walter lost everyone he loved in one night. After that, guilt consumed him. He shut down most of the resort and isolated himself in the mountains. But every year, during winter storms, strange things happened underground. Workers quit after hearing noises. Some claimed they saw shadows. Others said the property was haunted. Daniel listened quietly. You stayed because you are not afraid? Walter asked. Daniel shook his head slowly. No, I stayed because my daughter needs me. Walter stared at him silently. For the first time in years, something changed in the old man's expression. Respect. Over the following months, Walter and Daniel formed an unlikely friendship. Walter taught him about business, repairs, investments, and property management. Daniel worked harder than ever. And slowly, the old lodge began coming back to life. Cabins reopened. Guests returned. Profits increased. One evening Walter invited Daniel and Lily to dinner inside the main lodge. Lily laughed while eating pancakes beside the giant fireplace. Walter watched her quietly with tears in his eyes. She reminds me so much of my granddaughter, he whispered. Daniel smiled gently. She likes you too. Then Walter said something unexpected. I'm getting old, Daniel. Daniel looked up. Walter continued. I built this place with my bare hands. But I don't have anyone left to leave it to. Daniel frowned in confusion. What are you saying? Walter slid a folder across the table. Inside were legal documents. Ownership papers. Daniel's hands trembled. You can't be serious. Walter nodded slowly. You brought life back to this place. Not because of money, but because you cared. That matters. Daniel was speechless. No. I can't take this. Yes, you can, Walter replied firmly. Because you earned it. Tears filled Daniel's eyes. For years life had beaten him down until he believed he was worth nothing. And now someone finally saw value in him again. But life wasn't finished testing him yet. A week later, the biggest storm in decades hit the mountains. Snow buried roads. Winds shattered windows. Power lines collapsed across the region. Guests panicked inside the lodge. Then disaster struck. One of the underground fuel systems exploded. Fire spread rapidly through the maintenance tunnels. Alarms screamed throughout the property. Smoke filled the halls. Daniel immediately rushed underground while everyone evacuated. He knew if the generators exploded completely, the entire lodge would burn. Walter grabbed his arm. It's too dangerous. But Daniel looked at the terrified families around him. Children crying. People trapped by the storm. And suddenly he remembered the night Walter lost his family. I'm not letting history repeat itself, Daniel said. Then he disappeared into the smoke. Underground conditions were horrifying. Flames spread across pipes and walls. Heat became unbearable. Daniel crawled through smoke desperately trying to shut down the fuel lines manually. Metal beams groaned overhead. The fire moved closer. Then suddenly part of the ceiling collapsed behind him. He was trapped. For one terrifying moment, Daniel thought about Lily growing up without a father. Tears filled his eyes. No, he whispered desperately. Using every ounce of strength left, Daniel forced himself forward through the burning tunnel. Finally he reached the emergency valve. The wheel was rusted nearly solid. He grabbed it with both hands and pulled with everything he had. Nothing. Flames exploded nearby. Daniel screamed in pain as heat scorched his arms. Then he thought about Lily smiling. About their apartment. About finally having hope again. And with one final desperate effort, the valve turned. Instantly the fuel flow stopped. The fire began dying rapidly. Above ground, the lights stabilized. Guests cheered as emergency systems returned. But Daniel never came back upstairs. Rescue crews searched frantically through smoke-filled tunnels. Walter pushed past firefighters ignoring their warnings. Then finally they found him unconscious near the emergency valve. Barely alive. For 2 days Daniel remained in the hospital. Lily refused to leave his side. Walter sat quietly in the waiting room the entire time. Then finally, on the third morning, Daniel opened his eyes. Lily burst into tears, hugging him tightly. You promised everything would be okay, she cried. Daniel weakly smiled. I know, sweetheart. A month later, news about Daniel's bravery spread everywhere. Reporters called him a hero. The story of the struggling single dad who saved dozens of lives touched millions across the country. Donations poured in for Lily's future. But the biggest surprise came during a ceremony at the restored mountain lodge. Guests, workers, firefighters, and reporters gathered inside the grand hall. Walter stepped onto the stage holding a microphone. This man came here when nobody else would, Walter said emotionally. He took the job nobody wanted because he refused to give up on his daughter. The crowd applauded loudly. Walter continued. He saved this lodge. He saved lives. And he reminded me what family means. Then Walter handed Daniel a final envelope. Inside was the official deed to the entire property. The lodge now belonged to Daniel Carter. The crowd erupted into cheers. Daniel stood frozen in disbelief. Just 1 year earlier, he couldn't even pay rent. Now he owned the very place that changed his life forever. But the greatest moment came later that night. After everyone left, Daniel stood outside under the snowy mountain sky holding Lily's hand. Daddy, she asked softly. Yeah? Does this mean we finally have a home? Daniel looked at the glowing lodge surrounded by pine trees and warm lights. For the first time in years, he smiled without fear. Yes, sweetheart, he whispered. We finally do. Lily hugged him tightly as snowflakes drifted softly around them. And somewhere nearby, Walter watched from the lodge window with tears quietly rolling down his face. Because after years of loneliness and regret, he finally had a family again too. Life has a strange way of rewarding people who refuse to quit. Sometimes the opportunity that changes your life doesn't come wrapped in comfort or success. Sometimes it arrives disguised as the job nobody wants, the struggle nobody envies, or the risk everyone else is too afraid to take. Daniel never became rich because of luck. He became successful because even when life destroyed everything around him, he still chose responsibility over surrender. He kept fighting for his daughter. And in the end, that made all the difference. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more emotional and inspiring stories just like this one. And remember, sometimes your hardest season becomes the beginning of your greatest blessing. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.